Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the rebroadcast of Session 7 for the TomRichey.net 8-month writing clinic. I had some technical difficulties last time, got kicked off, didn't realize it for about 10 minutes, so I figured that I would just start over tonight. And this session is going to focus on complex understanding. This is a new point that's been added to the rubric, but I think that it also incorporates some old points. So let me go ahead and get this started, and then we'll have a little bit of Q&A once I'm finished, if anybody's still watching by that time. So, ladies and gentlemen, Session 7 is going to focus on complex understanding. Now, as far as what do we mean by this, okay, complex understanding includes a lot of things here. Okay, so the point says demonstrates a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. The response must demonstrate a complex understanding, which must be part of the argument, not merely a phrase or reference. This could include explaining nuance by analyzing multiple variables, explaining both similarity and difference, both continuity and change, or multiple causes, or both causes and effects. Now, note this one I think is going to be most helpful for the LEQ. You can see where those thinking skills, those three thinking skills, are emphasized there. Explaining relevant and insightful connections within and across periods, confirming the validity of an argument by corroborating multiple perspectives across themes, and qualifying or modifying an argument by considering diverse or alternative views or evidence. Now, these last two kind of take the analysis point from the previous rubric, and it's kind of incorporated into here. And also, when you note explaining relevant and insightful connections within and across periods, what we see here is the old synthesis point, it looks like. So there are a number of options, and a lot of this stuff is stuff we've seen before, just presented in a different way and lumped in a box together for this complex understanding point. Now, before I go into this any further, I want to note that complex understanding is an advanced skill. It is not for everyone. Not everyone's going to get 7 points on the DBQ, 6 points on the LEQ, nor do they need to. This is not necessary simply to pass the exam, but there are teachers who are members of this writing clinic who have students trying to make fives. There are students who, if they're going to purchase this writing clinic, they're probably looking to score a 4 or a 5 on the exam. So this is kind of an icing on the cake point, and something that is really, you don't have to get the other 5 or 6 points to get this point, but I think that most people who score this point will have scored the other 5 or 6 points. And one thing we need to note here is, as I go into this, I'm going to be putting my best guesses out there, but this point has never been scored at the AP reading. And so as far as that goes, we're going to have to get some feedback from AP readers. We're going to have to see, you know, what's going to be the best way to score this point. And in next year's writing clinic, we'll have a bit more certainty, but I'm going to do the best I can with the information we have here. And one thing that I want to note here, that my theory on this is that there are 5 different ways to earn this point. They've given really a whole lot of options, and I think that this is going to give the reader a lot of discretion, kind of like, you know, somebody giving an A+ or something like that. That this is really, I think that de facto, it's going to be a point for the reader to kind of go in there and figure like, hey, I'm really impressed with this. Where I get this from is the old AP Euro rubric used to have a basic core of 6 points. These were clearly defined points on an analytic scoring rubric. And then once a student scored all of those points, they were eligible to earn expanded core points, 3 discretionary points, up to 3, on a holistic rubric. And it looked something like this. I'm going to click on here and let's take a look at this rubric. Now, remember, it's not like that in the sense that used to on the old rubric exam, on the old Euro rubric, somebody earned the basic core. They had to earn all 6 before they could be eligible for this. But you see where this has a very similar kind of feel here where you've got all of these different options where the reader can give somebody credit. And so I think that it's going to be similar to that, except it's not going to have any requirements to get this point. But I don't think that this is going to be someone's third point or fourth point or something like that. I think that people who earn this will typically be the fifth point, the sixth point, or the seventh point. But I think it's going to be awarded to just essays that are in general impressive. Okay, so what I see here as a possible end game is the College Board wants to make this stuff look like it's all, that it's all mechanical, but really there is a lot of human decision making here, a lot of human discretion. And so I think that what's happening here is that the reader is going to have some discretion without the College Board coming out and saying that the reader has discretion. And first of all, when we look at the term nuance, okay, now what is nuance? I mean, when it comes down to it, it comes down to somebody really seeing some things in the documents or making an argument that seems very complex, something that's impressing the reader. Like this student is coming from a different angle than other students are coming from. This student saw something that other students didn't see. And I think when you go through a term like nuance, it really gives that reader the room to give a discretionary point, kind of the wow factor. I am really impressed with this essay. Not only has it checked all the boxes, but wow, look at what this kid has done here. And so I think that that really functionally is going to be how this point is awarded. Now, that's my theory. We'll see if that plays out at the AP reading. Now, for teachers and for students, I think that it's very important that you pick a strategy because there are these 5 different ways to earn this point. I think it's very important that, if you're a teacher, you think about how am I going to encourage students to score this point on the DBQ? How am I going to encourage students to score this point on the LEQ? And to pick one instead of saying like, oh, I'm going to do one of these, or I'm going to tell my students to do one of these, because, I think at the end of the day, with this thing being so formulaic that a lot of students are going to need some guidance. Now, other students may earn this point on their own. There are some exceptionally brilliant students out there that are just going to write such an amazing essay that they're going to earn this point possibly without us teaching it to them. So as far as this goes, for me, I think that for the DBQ, corroborating or qualifying evidence, and for the LEQ, going into multiple causes or similarity or continuity, because your standard LEQ essay will either emphasize one cause, or it will emphasize differences only, or it will emphasize change only. And so, as far as that goes, for the DBQ, I'm a big fan of corroborating or qualifying evidence. Now, there was a professor I had in grad school that would talk about putting historical sources in conversation with each other. And I think that I use that in my classroom all the time. This idea that, there are these 7 documents. How would they talk together? Okay, so if the documents are grouped in a T chart, now that's where my whole system kind of comes together here. Because if the documents are already grouped in a T chart, then it's going to be easy for these documents that have already been grouped with similar documents along similar themes or similar perspectives. It's going to be easy for them to converse with each other. And so, some questions to ask here: do the people who appear in these documents agree or disagree? What can account for this agreement or disagreement? For example, when you take into account there is an Industrial Revolution DBQ for AP Euro, and one of the documents is from a classical liberal, and another one is from a romantic or a socialist or somebody like that. The differences in perspective can account for the way that they're seeing things. Is one of the documents more trustworthy than the other one? So the student, while they're doing their POV and historical situation, audience, and purpose, they can chime in. If they find like one of these documents to be more helpful or more credible than the other, I think that they're getting into a complex understanding because they're not just presenting the documents one after another and summarizing them, or even just using them for an argument, but they're really seeing through them. So I think that that is something that we're going to, that's going to be helpful on here. Now, as far as getting into this, okay, so let me go ahead and look at a DBQ. Now, I've got this on the archive page. I've got a sample DBQ for APUS history. I've got a sample DBQ for APUS history that I wrote. And this is based on the DBQ on the French and Indian War, the 2004 DBQ. Now, I believe that this is, this is a link to that DBQ. And so the prompt is analyze the ways in which the French and Indian War altered the relationship between Britain and its American colonies in the period 1740 to 1766. And of course, as we go through here, we've already got the documents grouped. We've got documents 1 and 2 on westward expansion. Then we've got colonists being treated as inferior by the British, and then post-war British economic policies. And so as far as this goes, going into a complex understanding, let's see. Okay, so here we go. Here I have an example of corroboration. Now, I think I do this a few times in this document. Okay, so two documents are used together to support the argument that colonists were treated as second-class citizens. So let's take a look here and see how these two documents are being used together as evidence. During the war, the colonists were often treated as second-class citizens of the British Empire. A Massachusetts soldier wrote in his diary about the unfair treatment he was receiving, claiming that the British Army was depriving colonial soldiers of liquor and clothes while forcing them to remain in the fort beyond their enlistments. While it is possible that the British were treating colonial soldiers poorly, war can often be difficult and soldiers have to go through hardship. Keeping a diary is a good way for a soldier to vent to himself, especially when bored sitting in a cold fort all day. George Washington, although he was an upstanding and wealthy citizen of Virginia, had to practically beg and flatter General Braddock and his aide for a position to serve as a volunteer in the war, document 3. As a colonist, Washington wasn't given a commission in the British Army, but only as a militia officer. He wasn't taken seriously and had to serve under General Braddock, who ended up being an idiot who got himself and his men killed in spite of Washington's flattery. Now, the thing is, what I've done here is I'm using these two documents. So if you're setting up the DBQ already to where the documents are used to support the same points, what I have here are two documents being used to prove the same point. So if you've got your essay organized and it's set up like this and the documents are corroborating with each other, I think that that's going to be a good strategy to earn this point. Now, another thing I do here, and this is where if you've got things set up like this, do this multiple times in an essay. Do this with every paragraph. So in this case, I've got a contradiction here between two documents, and it's noted and analyzed. Document 2 has already been used and analyzed, but it helps bring it in again. So I'm using a document for the second time, but I'm using it argumentatively and I'm using it to contradict. Okay, so as far as this goes, by far the biggest factor that caused tension between the British government and the American colonies was the change in British policies about taxation and trade. After the war, many colonists were excited about the future and quick to claim credit, as evidenced by Reverend Thomas Bernard's sermon, where he claimed that New England's children had zealously pitched in to help with the war effort, document 5. This, of course, contradicts the Massachusetts soldier's diary entry written during the war, since he was anything but zealous. But since Barnard is speaking after the war ended, it is typical for people to romanticize a war and their contributions to it after the fact. British officials were not nearly as impressed with the colonists' contributions to the war, instead noting that the colonists were costing money and the taxes being collected from colonial trade were not sufficient to even pay the cost of maintaining them. And so the thing is here that what I've done is I've used three documents and put them in a conversation rather than presenting the documents in isolation. And in this case, we're seeing some contradictory evidence here. So, what I think that the key to earning this point on the DBQ is to put these documents in conversation and to make this, to make this evidence really that you're not presenting evidence in isolation, because that's really, when you're thinking about doing the work of a historian, it's really focused in terms of being able to use multiple sources and come from multiple perspectives, rather than simply putting one thing out there and expecting that to be plenty to go on. So as far as that goes, that is my preferred way to tackle that particular thing on the DBQ. Now, of course, as a teacher, there are other things that you could, other approaches that you could make, but this one is my favorite on the DBQ. Now, as far as the LEQ, I think that it's really in terms of going in and, doing the other part of the thinking skill, because the basic prompt is going to ask students to evaluate a single cause, or to show how the extent to which two things were different, or the extent to which something changed in a time period. So, under the old rubric, the one before this most recent revision, the student actually had to do both of these things. So on the LEQ, what used to earn the student the thinking skill point is now going to earn the student 2 points: the thinking skill point and the complex understanding point. Now, an example here would be in an sample essay that I wrote on the extent to which the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance were different from each other. And so, as far as that goes, in my body paragraphs 1 and 2, I am focusing on the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. I've got the thesis here. The Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance were different from each other because Italian humanists focused on the individual and on secular concerns, while Northern humanists focused on reforming society based on Christian principles. Now, the thesis should also, now it's not necessarily a requirement, but I think it's good for the thesis to actually also incorporate that complex understanding. So both movements were similar because of their shared focus on classical studies. And so I focus on the Italian Renaissance in the first body paragraph, on the Northern Renaissance in the second body paragraph, and then body paragraph 3, where I'm intentionally going for the complex understanding point. I'm going to write here, although the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance writers had different goals, they were all humanists who used the classics to try to help humans improve themselves. Thomas More was inspired by Plato's Republic, which depicted an ideal state where individuals sacrificed their individuality to help the community. Similarly, Machiavelli looked to Roman emperors for examples of what a strong ruler should be. So while in the DBQ, I think that the best path is to make the documents converse with each other, I think the LEQ, the best path there is going to be to just look at the other side of what the prompt is asking you to do. Bring in an additional cause, or look at a similarity, or a way that there has been continuity. So as far as that goes, let me check for questions real quick and see if we've got any. And then I'm going to talk about synthesis a little bit, because some teachers, I'm not a big synthesis advocate, but there are some teachers who still want to teach that. They still like that angle. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about that for a little bit, even though I'm personally not a big fan of synthesis, especially having experienced synthesis at the AP reading. There are some really atrocious attempts at synthesis, and it requires a student to have a great deal of understanding that I think most high school students don't have. Now, can some do it? Yes, but when that was one of the points on the exam, I told my students, if it falls into your lap, great, but don't try to make it happen. So here is a bit about synthesis, just in case. Okay, now first of all, as far as that, is it still a thing? And yes, it does look like one of the options is to connect the argument to something outside of the prompt's time and place. Okay, so what we see here is explaining relevant and insightful connections within and across periods. Okay, so that's what we're doing here, is we're basically connecting the argument to something outside of the prompt's time and place. Now, as far as why I'm not a huge fan of synthesis, On the 2017 Euro exam, 30% of students were able to synthesize something on the DBQ. Only 10% of students were able to do it on the LEQ. In AP US history, it was about 1/5 of students on the DBQ and the LEQ. So a lot of students tend to have a hard time with this, and I feel like that's a path that is not as straightforward and not as easy for a student to do. So that's one of the reasons. I mean, I think that people try to make some really crazy comparisons. But if you've got strong students, and especially, let's think about this, okay? Should I teach synthesis? I've got Vladimir Lenin and William III there, which some students are liable to try to make those kinds of comparisons between the Glorious Revolution and the Russian Revolution, which are kind of hard to prepare. Kind of hard to compare. And so, do you teach upperclassmen or underclassmen? If you've got students who have taken an AP history course before and they remember a lot of what they learned, it might work. Okay. Now, if you've got underclassmen, I really wouldn't recommend trying to get them to synthesize because they don't have a background in another historical subject. Are most of your students first-time AP history students or seasoned veterans? Again, the older your students are, the more AP history courses they have under their belt, especially if you're, in some schools, they offer all 3 AP history students, and students who are seniors may be taking their 3rd AP history course. That may be a good group to see if they can synthesize stuff. So if veterans, do they have a good grasp of what they've learned? That's the other thing. Sometimes students, when they come back in January, they forget what they learned first semester, much less what they learned last year. So as far as that goes, I would take all that into consideration. Now, a few types of synthesis. First of all, the most common synthesis, time and or place, okay? That we're basically taking the argument to a time and or a place outside of the scope of the prompt. And this can be from any time in history. Now, remember, it doesn't have to be limited to the content of the exam you're taking. And in fact, a lot of times I think it's easier for students to use things from another course. So, as far as that, and I think that's one of the reasons they took the mandatory synthesis point out. They never really explained why they did it. But my theory is that upperclassmen had an undue advantage over underclassmen who were taking their first AP course. And so, as far as this goes, it needs to extend an argument. Okay. So, synthesis, it's more than just a comparison. Okay. So, as far as that goes, if it's not related to the thesis, okay, then it's not synthesis. Okay. It has to be something that has to do with the central thing. It needs to be relevant. And so, what could I use? Now, that's the other thing that some people, a lot of students are like, oh, well, if it's about this, what would I synthesize with this? Wrong way to look at it. It needs to be in the prompt. So just make sure that, just like with anything else, needs to be more than one sentence, needs to include at least one valid detail. That's what we talked about with contextualization as well. Now, for example, the Reformation. If it's a comparison LEQ prompt about the Reformation, and let's say that it's wanting to know the extent to which Martin Luther and Henry VIII were different from each other. Well, one thing that you could do to possibly get another point to kind of bring in another insightful connection within or across periods, John Calvin. Okay, so if the prompt is about Luther and Henry VIII, possibly bringing in John Calvin, something like this. While Henry VIII's Reformation was largely rooted in his desire to challenge the church's political power, and Luther was rooted primarily in specific doctrinal disputes, John Calvin devised a whole new system of Christian theology. In his Institutes of the Christian Religion, Calvin outlined a systematic theology built around the ideas of the sovereignty of God and predestination. Calvin's start from scratch contrasted with Luther's approach, which was to start with specific disagreements he had with the Catholic Church. This is part of the reason why Calvinists refer to themselves as Reformed, setting themselves apart from more moderate reformers. And so with something like this, what I've done here is I've written a whole new paragraph, and I've taken this argument about Henry VIII and Martin Luther, and I'm bringing in Calvin to add a bit of complexity, complex understanding here. And another type of synthesis, when this was a thing on the exam, and people still want to teach this, is what I call PS synthesis. And this is basically like just going into the next period. Okay. So, taking your argument and going outside of the time period and kind of going into a postscript. What happened after this? So, if it's the American Revolution, maybe looking at the Articles of Confederation or the US Constitution or Shays' Rebellion or something like that. So as far as that goes, I think that especially when you're looking at like a continuity and change over time essay, sometimes going into the next historical period can be good. Now, if it's something that is a post-war prompt, like it's after World War II, maybe you could go into a previous time period. Again, if this is something that you want to do or your students want to do, it's an idea. Now, current event synthesis, I want to touch on that real quick, on that current event synthesis is okay for synthesis as long as it is substantive. A couple of years ago, there was a prompt. The DBQ for AP Euro, for example, was about how Otto von Bismarck, challenged traditional notions of conservatism. Now, some people, of course, this was 2016, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and this was when Donald Trump was running for president. And there were students who actually got credit if what they could say was intelligent. Okay. As far as it was substantive, it really explained how Donald Trump was challenging traditional notions of conservatism in the United States. When you think of, the more traditional conservatives he was running against. And so this is something that, worked. But there again, there were several students who made very superficial comparisons between Donald Trump and Otto von Bismarck, and they did not get credit for that. So, if you've got a kid that's really strong with current events and politics, they could try to pull it off, but then again, needs to be substantive. Again, it is a very specific kind of student, a very advanced student who picks up this sort of skill. And then finally, I would like to note across the pond synthesis. Now, if you're taking the AP Euro exam, then is there a similar phenomenon going on in the United States around the same time or vice versa? Okay, because the thing is that really it just depends what was the first exam that you took. Okay, so if you want to, there was one time there was a prompt about women's suffrage that was on the AP Euro exam, and the prompt neglected to say in Europe. And this was before synthesis was even a thing, but it was it was a real train wreck because basically a lot of students were just using United States history stuff. They were taking AP Euro. They didn't know anything about the suffrage movement in European history. And so they were just using US history. And since the prompt didn't say specifically in Europe, the students were able to get a certain amount of points for that. So, for example, if we had a prompt about, the women's movement or something like that in Europe or in the United States, then somebody could bring in something that's going on across the pond, so to speak. So, for example, here, while women in Europe were pursuing the right to vote, women in the United States were doing the same thing. At the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted a Declaration of Sentiments modeled after the Declaration of Independence, which demanded several rights for women, including the right to vote. As was the case in Europe, this was a decades-long struggle that came to fruition during World War I. So as far as that goes, again, synthesis, it's really up to you whether you want to go that route. That is something that, I've heard some teachers who are fans of it. I'm not personally, okay? But the most important thing is that if you're a student or a teacher picking one thing to do, okay, that this is how you're going to pitch it to your students by and large. Okay, so as far as that, yes, Lisa Britt, that is exactly what I have encountered. Just some really almost things that either make me cringe or laugh or stuff like that. But yeah, I think that synthesis is great. I think that we're just in a situation where we've got so much to try to teach these kids, and they may be taking their first AP history course, and it's kind of difficult. I will hang around for just a moment, just in case there are any questions or anything like that. But again, the complex understanding point, it's a new point. not for everyone, and there are several ways to earn it. And we will see if this just kind of ends up being a sort of icing on the cake, discretionary point that a reader can, point out or something like that. So we will definitely, have more in next year's writing clinic thinking about like, okay, how is it that most people are actually earning this point? All right, so it has been a pleasure, and of course, this is the end of the explanatory part of this writing clinic. And I will be back next month, and I will be posting some dates soon for the critiques, where I'm actually going to go through essays and give critiques. Thank y'all so much, and have a good night. It's always a pleasure.